You're in bed right now, or maybe on the couch, door shut, lights low. There is a 100% chance that nobody is watching you sleep, and nobody is listening to the internal monologue running through your head. To you, this is normal. It's the baseline of a decent life. But if you could grab a human from almost any other point in our 300,000-year history and drop them into your room right now, they wouldn't feel relaxed. They'd feel abandoned. They'd feel exposed. They'd feel like the social fabric of the world had unraveled, leaving them shivering in a vacuum. Because for the vast majority of human existence, privacy wasn't a right. It wasn't even a dream. It was a terrifying concept that looked a lot like exile. Today, we're going to look at how we went from sleeping in giant human piles to building literal walls between us and the people we love, and why you're quiet. Private life is actually the weirdest experiment in human history. Let's start at the beginning. If you were a hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago, your world was defined by the group. You lived in a camp of maybe 30 people. You hunted together, ate together, and when the sun went down, you slept together. But humans have always been, well, humans. Even then, we needed a break from each other. But how do you get a break when there are no walls, no doors, no curtains? Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer groups found something fascinating. As a camp grows in size, families don't build fences. They just nudge. They move their sleeping mats just a few feet further away from the center. It's privacy by distance. Think of it as the Stone Age version of personal space. You didn't have a room, but you had a zone. If you were 10 feet away, you were in a private conversation. If you were 20 feet away, you were alone. The dirt between you and your neighbor was the only wall you had. You lived your entire life being perceived. Every argument, every sneeze, every romantic moment was witnessed by the people who kept you alive. You weren't an individual. You were a cell in a larger body. Now, let's fast forward. You'd think that once we started building permanent houses, privacy would improve. Actually, it got worse. Picture a typical peasant home in medieval Europe. From the outside, it looks like a house. From the inside, it's a barn. It's one single, open room with a fire in the middle and a hole in the roof. In this room, the family cooked. They ate. They worked, and when night fell, they all laid down on the same floor. But they weren't alone. Because wood was expensive and animals were valuable, the family's livestock lived in that room too. You'd be trying to fall asleep while a cow breathed 3 feet from your head and a pig adjusted itself in the corner. This wasn't because medieval people were gross. It was pure cold survival. One room is easier to heat than 5. One fire keeps everyone, and the animals, from freezing to death. Privacy was a luxury they literally could not afford. To want a separate room was to want to be cold. Surely, you're thinking the rich had it better. Not really. Go up the social ladder to a lord's manor. You'd find a great hall. This was the center of the universe. During the day, it was a courtroom and a dining hall. At night, it turned into a massive, communal bedroom. The lord and lady might have a slightly nicer bed at one end, perhaps on a raised platform, but the floor was covered in their knights, their servants, their guests, and their dogs. If you were a servant, you slept where you worked. You were never off the clock, because you were never out of sight. Even the act of sleeping was a social performance. There's a reason there wasn't a word for privacy in medieval Latin. The word privatio meant to be deprived. To be private was to be stripped of your place in society. It was a punishment, not a privilege. So, what happened when the noise became too much? What happened when you just needed to be not looked at for 5 minutes? Humans got creative with furniture. They invented the box bed. Imagine a massive wooden wardrobe. Now, put a mattress inside it. These were common across Europe for centuries. You would climb into this wooden box, pull the heavy sliding doors shut, and latch them from the inside. This is one of the most telling artifacts in human history. It tells us that even when we lived in one room with 10 people and a goat, we were desperate for a boundary. Inside that box, it was pitch black. It was warm. And most importantly, nobody could see you. People would sit in their box beds to pray, to read by a tiny candle, or just to think their own thoughts without someone asking what they were doing. For the poor, who couldn't afford a wooden cabinet, they used the symbolic wall, the curtain. A piece of fabric hung around a bed didn't stop noise. It didn't stop smells. But it was a social signal. It meant, for the next 8 hours, pretend I don't exist. The real shift, the one that leads directly to your bedroom, started in the 17th century. And like most things, it started with the rich being snobby. In France, the wealthy started adding a tiny room off their main bedroom called a cabinet or a closet. It wasn't for clothes, it was for the self. It was a room where a person could go to be truly, legally, and physically alone. It was the ultimate status symbol. It said, I am so powerful that I can afford to occupy space that serves no purpose other than my own solitude. But even then, houses were still chaotic. Before the late 1600s, houses didn't really have hallways. To get from point A to point C, you had to walk through point B. If you wanted to go to the library, you had to walk through your sister's bedroom while she was getting dressed. There was no way to move through a building without being an intruder. Then came the corridor. The hallway is arguably the most antisocial invention in history. It allowed us to move through a house without interacting. It turned rooms into islands. Suddenly, you could lock your door and the rest of the house effectively vanished. By the 1800s, privacy moved from being a luxury to being a moral requirement. The Victorians were obsessed with propriety. They decided that sleeping in a shared room wasn't just crowded, it was beastly. They began to preach the gospel of the individual bedroom. They argued that children needed their own space to develop a soul. They argued that even husbands and wives should have separate beds to maintain their dignity. This is where the shame of the communal life began. We started to view our ancestors not as communal and connected, but as primitive and dirty. We traded the physical warmth of the group for the psychological comfort of the lock. Which brings us back to you, sitting in your room. Sleep historians have a theory. Our modern normal is actually a biological disaster. For millions of years, we evolved to sleep to the sound of other people's breathing. It was our safety signal. If you could hear your tribe, you knew you were safe. Today, we sleep in soundproofed rooms with white noise machines trying to mimic the sounds of a world we spent 300 years trying to shut out. We have more privacy than any king or queen in the year 1200 could have dreamed of. We have noise-canceling headphones to create a box bed for our ears. We have private apartments that function like giant closets. But there's a price. We are the first humans to ever feel lonely while being surrounded by thousands of people. We've finally won the war for privacy, but we might have accidentally exiled ourselves in the process. Solitude is a beautiful thing. It's where we create, where we reflect, and where we truly become ourselves. But it's a brand new invention. We are still Stone Age creatures living in a Victorian architectural experiment. So, the next time you feel like your apartment is too small, or you're annoyed that your roommate is making noise in the kitchen, try to remember the box bed. Remember the medieval Great Hall. Remember that for most of your ancestors, the sound of someone else's life was the only thing that let them sleep soundly. You aren't just in your room. You are living in a miracle of isolation that took 10,000 years to build. If you think the bedroom was a mess, wait until we talk about the bathroom. Because if you think no privacy is bad when you're sleeping, imagine it when you're busy.